the elephant in the room. Let's talk about the miracles of Christ. And I will not even spend time asking questions here. Let's just go straight to it. Um, so let's go back to definitions. I find that in our society today, definitions are important. So let's go back to the definition. What's a miracle? And if you may, kindly give an example to the same. Danson, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's actually interesting just to begin by saying that that word miracle is actually not found in the original Greek New Testament. Um, Even find translations like NIV that use that word. What we have really is the word sign, okay,
Mhm.
and that's what we are going to work with because we want to remain as faithful to the text as soon as possible. As possible. So this is the other thing I would like to say before I can define. This word miracle is used differently in different contexts. Okay, so if I walked into a church and say, I am serving a miracle working God, right? Or if I said, oh yeah, this morning I actually saw a miracle. I was able to make it to church on time, regardless of the fact that there was traffic on Langata Road. Um, so what would that say to the person who's listening? This is something that happened. The fact that you made it means that there were some hindrances to you achieving your goal, and somehow you achieved, and so you called that a miracle. But if we are to define a miracle in the theological sense, okay, it would be different. So I'm just going to sample maybe just three of some of the renderings that I believe represent that very word miracle. And here I'm using the word miracle loosely because the word miracle is actually not found in the original New Testament. A miracle can be defined as a supernatural event, okay? An extraordinary work performed by the immediate power of God in the external perceivable world, okay, which is an act against nature that only God can do. And here, what I'm saying is these are things that are done by God that defy the natural sense of order in which things happen. So if a child is born today, there is a natural order in which children are born. So we would not say that a child being born is a miracle. Okay. Um, if then we had someone die and resurrect, then we would say that's a miracle. Why? Because there is a natural order in which things work. Meaning, if I die stone cold dead, I cannot, and I am not expected to rise from the dead, right? But then I rise from the dead, and that only God can do, right? And that is why Him claiming to bring back people from death, or even Jesus Christ claiming to come back from death, was one of the reasons why he was crucified, right? Because they did not see the word miracle uh, they do not think that Jesus Christ would defy the natural order in which things happen. If I walked into Galleria Mall today and did not find a parking lot, and all of a sudden someone shows up and they pull back and I get a space, that's not really a miracle. That happens, right? So I wouldn't say that's a miracle. And again, uh, this is the other thing that I wanted to say. A sign points us to something. So if something happens and it has no significance, it has no underlying significance, such that I would ask, what did the sign point to? And there is no answer to that, then it's not a miracle. So in other words, every of what we see as signs, and in fact, John makes sure that in every of his stating of what Jesus Christ did, he helps us explain what that was pointing us to. For example, in Cana, Jesus Christ turning water into wine, right? This Jesus Christ was pointing us to the coming, to the unrealized eschatology. Basically, what I'm saying is to the coming order of things where God would have, where we would have the new creation, right? and there will be plenty and all that. I'm forgetting the text in Isaiah that talks about the abundance of provisions that come from God. Yeah, and his healings, right? They point us to the perfection that is coming in his second coming or something like that. So in the realist definition, and also I just want to mention one more thing, that you find out that miracles are also not as prominent in the texts of scripture. They are happening in specific seasons and times where there is an inauguration of an event, where there is a God revealing himself to people, right? For example, in the book of Exodus, when God, through Moses, wants to come back and reveal himself to Israel and call them to, then Moses is asking, oh, I'm going to go, and it's a burning bush. And how are they going to listen to me? And there is miracles, right? He puts his hand in his pocket, and then he gets it out, and it's leprous, right? And so he says, these signs are going to follow you, so I'm going to authenticate you because of the message that you carry. In the opening leaf for the prophets, we see Elijah and Elisha marked with so many miracles. Between Elijah and Elisha and Moses, there's hardly very many of them, right? And then from Elijah and Elisha, now you come all the way to the New Testament, where we see Jesus and the apostles performing miracles, and then there fades a season with which there are no miracles anymore. So yeah, in terms of definition, we have to get the fact that it is a sign, not only a sign, it's a supernatural work of God that defies the natural order in which things happen.
I'll just pick up on something that you've said there. It's a supernatural event. It's an immediate power of God, and only God can do in that sense. And I can't help but think about a question on someone's mind. So would you say answers to prayers are all miracles?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with Danson's definition of what a miracle is. And so no, an answer to prayer is not necessarily a miracle. Like if I pray for healing and God works through a doctor who has been trained for 6 years in med school and has the wisdom to prescribe the right drugs, and he gives me those drugs, and those drugs work in my system, none of that is miraculous. The same person that didn't pray might still receive the same outcome, and they might not. So that can be classified as it can be understood as an answer to prayer, but we wouldn't say that's a miracle in any meaningful sense of the word. Does it display God's love, covenant love for us? Yes, but does it display his sovereign authority over all creation to act in ways that are completely extraordinary? Well, no, it doesn't. And that's where you'd draw the line, I think. Is this displaying God's sovereign authority over all nature? Or is it displaying him working in the normal ways that he does work? Because when Danson talks about the natural order of things, it's not like that is divorced from what God is doing. God is working in that. And there are ways that he works in that in a very consistent pattern. And then when a miracle comes, then we're talking about him kind of transcending that normal way that he works in order to do something rather different, and therefore to show his complete sovereignty, so that we don't even come to the mistaken conclusion that, the laws of nature, God doesn't, yes, he works, but he only works through the laws of nature. No, he can do whatever he wants. And when he does kind of transcend that, that's when we would think of it as a miracle. But that doesn't mean in any way to say that an answer to prayer is not an answer to prayer. God works in an infinite number of ways on a daily basis through the general order of nature. And he does that to the blessing of his people. He does that to sustain his people. He does that to work all things for good for his people. So we're not in any way saying that God is not at work in the world. If we say that miracles are not normative, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that generally speaking, he is working through these particular ordained means that he put in place. That the world generally works in this way, so that when we do see something that completely transcends that, we're all the more blown away and all the more pointed to the Lord of all creation.
I can add on that. So if you're thinking about prayer, the word we would basically use for miracle, because the question then would be, what then would I say? Word providence, right? Or rather, if you like, divine providence, such that God is upholding, right? The Westminster Confession of Faith, God, the great creator of all things, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures, actions, and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy word, providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise and glory of his wisdom, power, justice, goodness, and mercy. Now, what I'm saying is God in his, so you're thinking about God's sovereignty, right? That he is in government of all things that happen, all means with which these things would happen, right? So if God ordains in his providence that he will heal your son or your child who is sick, he will also ordain the means with which he will do that. And one of the means with which he will do that is prayer. Okay, so prayer is a means with which God is performing his divine providence upon you and I. And so there are situations where you would pray, right? James chapter 3, if you could correct me, maybe James chapter 4 talks about elders laying hands on the sick, right? And they are healed, right? God uses the means of prayer to heal the person, but then we would not say that that's a miracle. Why? Because that's a divine order with which God performs his functions. And in as much as it is a divine natural order, as John has clearly stated, it is him who is in control. So if a pastor lays their hands on someone, or if I pray for someone and they get healed, it's okay, but it's divine providence, and God has ordained the means of prayer to do that. In other situations, people might not pray and you get healed, right? Or yes, you can have a doctor do that and you're healed. So in all that, you will not use the word miracle in that sense.
All right, thanks, Danson. And thank you for clarifying. I was hoping to jump on the term providence, picking on what John was saying, the general ways in which God works. But thanks for going ahead of us there. But before we preempt that and going back to its definition, Mwangi, you have been in a circle where miracles have been normative, and you've heard so many things about that by way of application. Now, you've had miracle service, you've had expect a miracle, demand a miracle, fast and pray for a miracle, even some say. Yeah, talk about that.
One of the things I see in such circles is, first, when you're in a circle that does all these, two things tends to happen to you as a believer. First, you start to not appreciate the essence of the signs that we see in scriptures happening. As Danson has properly explained, how the miracles and all, tend to mark turning points in the text. When we just make everything normative, it does seem honest that the miracles then that we see, or the signs and wonders that we see in the text, become sort of a prescription for us on what we must, claim or do or try to achieve in a sense. And we miss the fact that, as Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews would rightly put that God uses these signs to bear witness to his work. We tend to miss that quite a lot. And that's a sad affair, because we do not, again, read the scriptures in its entirety. We miss out. We miss out the fact that Jesus walking on water is not a prescription on how we should walk on a swimming pool, or how we should probably walk on some oceans in our lives, and and tend to try and think about these things. We forget that particular sign and wonder does prove that he is God over nature. He is the true messenger of God, that nothing is out of his control. Even the troubled sea, even the sea that man cannot get in control, he in fact can simply walk on it. He can tell it to come, and it's still. And so once we forget and turn our sight on the fact that a miracle is that may deem just normative and it just happens, we lose this beautiful moment in the text. We fail to see that it attests to the men of God who God has sent with his word. And also the other thing is that sadly these miracles that we claim and the people who actually claim them, it is sad to note that most of the people who claim to be workers of miracles and the function that we see miracles performing in the text being that they bear witness to the people who God has sent, most of them, you look at their lives and you wonder whether God can actually have sent such a person. Some of them, you listen to their theology and you wonder, they belittle God. They lack to see the sovereignty of God and the fact that God can do whatever he wishes to do, and no one can constrain him. No one can thwart his plans. So I think these are some of the areas that if we are not keen to see really how the scripture does structure and help us to see miracles coming to contribute to the story of scripture, we would lose. And ultimately, we would lose sight of the sovereignty of God.
All right, thanks, Mongi, for that. Very helpful, especially with your experience in the same. So, okay, let's use the case of Sarah and Abraham. Sarah is barren, and she gets a child at old age. Are we calling that a miracle? And so that if anyone who will watch this, perhaps, and say, okay, so these guys are saying that I should not expect a miracle, like there's a barren individual or someone is going through A, B, C, and D. Are we saying then that we should not expect a miracle, or basically what are we saying here?
Having also established what a miracle is, I think we should ask ourselves then if miracles are these supernatural and extraordinary things that can only be explained as the work of a divine being, in this case God, and they also come to bear witness, to be a testimony to his nature and all that. Does it fit as a miracle? If Sarah conceives at this age that is naturally not an age for women to conceive, does it fit in that? Does it fit in what we define as a miracle? And in so doing, does somebody who is also of that age and prays to God for a miracle, should they expect such a thing? For me, it would go back to what is the person expecting this to bear witness to? If you're expecting a miracle, and I'm not saying you shouldn't expect miracles, but to what end are you at 90 years old expecting God to work a miracle? Is it to beat your chest and actually just gloat over it, or is it bearing some witness to the very nature of God? Or to what end are you expecting this miracle? Because most of the time we are in different church circles, people are actually conditioned to expect miracles, as Mongi was saying. Just to add on to something on the normative use of the miracle, I think when miracles are used in the normative sense, and also having established the definition of a miracle, as Danson and the others have so rightly put, I think when miracles are used in a normative sense, there's some part of the definition that usually tends to be neglected. Case on point, we find people today who claim to perform miracles. They are the very same people that disregard the sense in which a miracle should come, which in this case to bear witness to something, or to bear witness to the sovereignty of God and just the very nature of God. So when that is lacking, you find that people use miracles to bring glory back to themselves. That's why in the current world, we find people who claim to be disciples of Christ or apostles or whatever they call themselves. They use miracles to bring glory. Point that because miracles are not happening, so to say, in the way that they would want people to see them, they even hire people to be recipients of the miracles, so that you'd find a pastor hiring a lame person so that they perform the miracle, because that is what people believe to be a miracle, and they want miracles to be happening, and we should be expecting a miracle right now, and it should happen in a certain way, yet disregarding the very sense in which miracles should or how miracles actually occurred in the Bible. If a miracle doesn't fit in that definition to the very end of it, then there's something lacking. And at the end of the day, it's just some other person's creation of what they say a miracle is.
John, let me.
Gift.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
But I think the question you asked is a good one. Apart from trying to ask ourselves, is it should we expect a miracle like Sarah, getting a child at 90-something years? I think first we ought to try and go back to the storyline and understand really what is happening in Genesis. Genesis 3, God has promised of a son that the son of a woman would come and crush the head of the serpent. So here we have sort of two lineages. We have the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And all the while in Genesis, actually, we tend to see as if the seed of the serpent keeps winning. Cain kills Abel. Lamech comes in and, even kills more people. And there's all this degradation. And it's like the seed of the serpent seems to just be scaling up and, growing and growing. But by the time we're getting the story of Abraham, we see an individual being chosen by God, and he's promised a child. He's promised that there's an offspring that will come, and through him, nations shall be blessed. We can see that as typological in terms of being ultimately fulfilled in Christ, but there's a sense in which it is fulfilled in Isaac. But then we see the wife is barren. They don't have a son. The wife comes up and hatches what we may call a brilliant plan to get the husband together with Hagar and probably get this child of promise, forgetting that she's not the one who actually promised the child. It's God who did, and so God sovereignly will bring about the child that He desires to be the child of promise to them. And so in this we see God outworking in order to sustain the lineage of Abraham that He has actually called and to fulfill that which He has already promised Abraham. He's told him He will be a father of nations. He will have as many children, more than the grains of sand. And all this promise is almost being seen not to be fulfilled in a sense, because we don't have a child yet. Who is going to inherit? Is it the servant? But no, God had already said, not your servant, but your child. Is it Ishmael? No, it is a child, your child, with your wife, Sarah. And so when we see it as a miracle, it's because it's pointing to that God shall ultimately sustain His people. He shall, He shall build His people. He shall continue to work in the lives of His people, in providing for His people. So He provides an offspring who comes, and the lineage continues on and on and on and on. So that's a miracle in that sense. So that doesn't mean that we want to now claim that I won't even wait until I'm 90, but I can try at least a slightly advanced age, just below 90, but an age where even things can be said, I have no hope for a child, now I'll try. That's not the prescription. There's a larger narrative that's happening. There's a way that God is sustaining the seed of the woman, is bringing forth that storyline, that even when hope is sort of seems lost, and it's almost gone, then here comes that child of the promise. And we can bring that even to Christ. When it seems as if all is lost, the kingdom of Israel is at disarray, here comes the Savior, not to save them and simply congregate them back to Jerusalem as the Jewish nation, but to bring salvation from the greatest oppressor, not the Roman soldiers, but sin, which is their greatest oppressor. So in that sense, you can see Abraham's and Sarah's, giving birth at an advanced age being a miracle in that sense, but it's not in any way a prescription for us. And if we go out claiming that it's a prescription, well, we are sorry, brothers, but you're misreading the text, and it cannot in any way be understood in that way.
I'd like Danso. I'll give you a scenario, then tell me if it's a miracle or not, and then now we'll come to John. Please, you started mentioning about providence, so I'd like you to open it, to continue on that thought. So Danso, I've heard this story before. This woman has been expecting. I'm sorry, we're belaboring on this as an example, but okay, let me use that one and another one. Then you tell me if that's a miracle. They are miracles. One, so this couple has been trusting the Lord for a kid for over 10, 15 years. Then maybe in their 20th year, the Lord gives them twins. And then they come and testify in church or whatever that may be and say that that's a miracle. So that's scenario one. Scenario two, someone has been fasting and praying for 40 days, for a car, and a car comes, or they've been fasting and praying for a job, as we very well know. Are those miracles, or how would you classify them?
Again, of course, you would expect that in such situations, given the fact that there is variation in the way we define that word miracle, that someone would say, wow, that's a miracle, right? Because just with the lingo, for lack of a better word, rather, because that's the only accessible word that they would use. And I would understand that. But if we come to the technical terms with which we define such things and identify them, then as I said earlier, you would classify that in a sense as divine providence. And I don't want to belabor on that and label all the two scenarios in that situation, right? First of all, we see that Jesus Christ condemns his followers and the people he taught against feasting on and pursuing him because of miracles, right? When he feeds 5,000 people, is it? And then they want to crown him as king, right? So this is it. The first scenario where this couple has been expecting a child for maybe 10, 15 years, and finally they get a twin. How many other people have had such scenarios, both Christians and non-Christians? Okay, there are very many scenarios like that. Well, there are few that are heard of, but I don't think that's the only scenario in the world that's happening, right? And then does it also defy the natural order in which things happen? Not really. There's a sense in which people who are barren at some point in their life get to have a child by very, very many means. So they can be the means of prayer, right? They would pray and God does provide a child for them. But there are those who would go to a doctor. But there are those who are pagan and they don't even know anything about God, and then they do their charms and everything, and they get the child. So in the sense of that, in the sense of just technically defining what a miracle is, I would say that's not a miracle, but that's a grand working of God, is it? Yeah, it is. You would say it's a supernatural outworking of God, and you would label that as providence and praise to God because he does that. And he does those things very many times. But is that sign pointing to something? Is that sign pointing to the fact that then your message is going to be valid or anything like that? No. So in the very sense of the technical term, what a miracle is or rather what a sign is, you wouldn't want to label that as a miracle. The second one of the brother who is fasting and praying and getting a seven-figure six-figure salary, first of all, he's actually praying for the wrong thing, right? That's not how we were taught to pray in the scriptures. And the fact that he gets it, and this is the other thing, right? The fact that things happen, the fact that you experience things does not make them true. Just because something is happening does not make it true. Just because you're having a certain experience, because this gentleman is gonna come from there and say, if you fast 40 days and 40 nights like me, God is gonna give you 7-figure salary with a car and a wife and everything like that. So you're literally changing the way in which we should see and define and know who God is. Because miracles are supposed to point us to something greater. Signs are supposed to point us to something greater. And that very person is Jesus Christ, right? John chapter 20 and verse 30 and 31, the writer says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Notice verse 31, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So I don't classify those two scenarios as miracles because of the strict sense in which the word miracle is defined. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And I like the fact that you're emphasizing the aspect of miracles from scriptures and not necessarily from a pastor or from a spiritual leader out there. So that is really, really helpful by way of definition, and by that helps us to now have a lens by which we view these normal occurrences and classify them as miracles or not. That's indeed helpful. So let's go to John. John, I would like you to talk about the providence of God. You had mentioned earlier that there were some of these things are general ways in which the Lord works to his children, and even non-believers, as he would say in scriptures, that he shines the sun for both believers and unbelievers, the rain as well. So I'd like you to talk about the providence of God and its goodness, in the sense that when some of these things happen, so that we get our heads out of everything being a miracle. You know, they say, if all you have in your hand is a hammer, then you will always hit something. So to remove this, so to speak, the hammer of miracles in our head, help us see that God actually does use the normal occurrences of life to answer prayers and to, yes, in that sense, please.
Sure. I'm trying to think how to approach this question. Yeah, I mean, it seems fairly clear from scripture that God works all things. There's nothing outside his sovereign control. He is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. And that includes things that we would probably, most of us would generally hesitate to say that God did this. For example, he sends an evil spirit to a king, so that king is deceived, so that he goes out into battle and is defeated. And you'd wonder, God's hand was in that. He defeats wise counsel so that bad counsel would prevail, so that his purposes come to pass. He is in charge of events that probably most of us looking on would be like, that was Satan doing it. And yeah, Satan was involved as well, and Satan had his purposes, but God has his purposes, and his purposes can't be thwarted. And what becomes amazing about that is that he says that he works all of his purposes for good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. And that doesn't mean that he works all of his might so that you get that 7-figure salary, so that you get that car, so that you get that house, so that you get that wife. No, it means he works all of those things for good, so that those whom he has chosen may be predestined, that those whom he predestined may be called, that those whom he's called may be justified, and those whom he's justified may be glorified, and in all of that, that they may be conformed to the very likeness of Christ. And so God would bring what we would generally classify as good things and what we would generally classify as bad things our way in just the proportions we need them, so that he would shape us towards his own purposes for us, which ultimately are Christ-likeness. And most of that, the majority of that, he does by very ordinary things. He works in very ordinary ways. And we are often very slow to realize that. I've had situations, for example, where for some reason, my computer at some point will stop working. Like, it's not an extraordinary thing. Technology breaks, we know that. Then I look at the situation and I'm like, hey, anyway, I've wasted too much time on this comp today. It was probably a good thing for the Lord to remind me of that through this kind of ordinary means. No one's going to classify that as a miracle. But God uses it to point me towards, could I be doing something better with my time? And obviously the answer is yes. And just in so many kind of very kawaida ways, God works. And that's what we sometimes forget when we rush into kind of looking at God in the miracles. We forget that God is in everyday life. God is working his ordinary purposes out through ordinary people and ordinary means in order to do something that is extraordinary in us. And when we run after all of these other things, and oftentimes the miracles fall into those categories that we've been describing, rather than being, God performed the extraordinary work of making me like you. That's, whether you classify it as a miracle or not, that is what we should all be most longing for God to do in us. And oftentimes that gets left behind. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think that's indeed helpful. At least now we can see that God uses the ordinary means to help us be more like him, including suffering. That God will use these means to get us to him. And I think that's a subject for a different time. But as we conclude on this matter, I hope we have exhausted it. And as we conclude on this, I'd like Mwangi, please help us here. So now that we've discussed this, we've seen the ordinary ways that God does things, God's goodness to both believers and unbelievers alike, God's goodness in answering a barren woman's prayer and giving them a child does not necessarily classify as a miracle, but it's God's goodness we see. Does that mean then there are no miracles?
I think the best way to approach such a play, such a discussion, and especially when it comes to, have they entirely ceased? Can we? So does it mean that God can never perform a miracle? I think if we are honest to accept and acknowledge the sovereignty of God, the fact that God is sovereign, we do, though we say that, and the term here is, miracles are not are not normative, in the sense that, we are to expect them on every single day basis. I mean, the question is, to what end, as it has been discussed. But if we are to honestly, with all honesty, appreciate the sovereignty of God, I think we'll land at a place where we say that God can choose to perform a miracle. God in his own ways may choose to do something that points us to himself, and break through the, and work out something in a supernatural way, transcending all the natural means that he can work through. He may choose to do that. And that's up to him. It's not up to us. And so I think it would be healthy for us, especially as Christians, to say that true, God can. He is not incapable. We are not talking about his incapability. What we are saying is that in these times, it does not seem that God has chosen to use those means predominantly to make himself known to the believers and to the people of the world. That's what we are saying. And so the main way that he has chosen for him to be known is through the proclamation of his word. Is when his word is heralded, and clearly so that all nations may hear this truth, God's truth. And in that sense, I think we can appreciate the sovereignty of God, the fact that he has chosen not to work miracles as his main way of witnessing about himself in these times. At the same time, balancing it with the fact that he can choose to do that. And I think to wrap this up, and especially the point that I'm making is to say that we need to see salvation and redemption as the greatest miracle of all. That a blind person, a spiritually blind person, one who could not choose God on his own accord, one who was lost, rejected God. Every single time that you found, you wouldn't come running to God and just to choose one of these popular songs, saying you're my papa. You wouldn't. You would basically be running the opposite direction. You would have some sort of reverence, some sort of idea that there's this supreme being that he wants me to be there, he wants me to relate with him, but you would never, in actual sense, come to God. And yet to see that God does work in such a dark heart, a hard heart. Actually, our state is basically dead, as Paul would put it in Ephesians. To see that God would give life to such and lovingly do so and actually pursue them, I think we see that as a way, and you're like, wow, that I think culminates what we may call miracles, and see that we can actually say that we once were dead in our transgressions, but now we are alive in Christ. Such a transition is amazing. And so I think if we see that, and you see that is brought by the death of Christ again on the cross, what he achieved for us on the cross, his death and his resurrection, actually his life, death, and resurrection. So we get to see that as probably what I myself would claim to be the ultimate of all miracles, because we may get healed from diseases in this life, but we will get sick again and die probably. We may ask for children. They will grow up and leave our homes and go and start their own lives. But when we have Christ, we know that we have eternity, and it's not ending in the grave. That's not where it stops. There's hope for us. There's eternity that is there for us to dwell with Christ, to be with Christ, and to enjoy his companionship for eternity. So I think that's the way I would advocate that we hold the particular matter. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mwangi. So lastly, Danson, I'm going to throw you a question here. Answer it however you may. You did not receive a miracle. So this is a conversation. Then someone says, your individual, your friend, your parent, your sibling did not receive a miracle because they lacked enough faith.
Yeah, sure. So this is what I'm thinking. Defining first the question, or understanding the question, breaking it down. What I get from the person asking is that miracles is equal to my faith. Okay. Then that means that God would not work out a miracle except for your participation in the order in which it happens. Okay, and that's not a biblical way of thinking about it, because miracles have everything to do with God's sovereignty and God's purpose, and so He may work those things out with, actually, regardless of. So I'm just trying to go back to what Edwin said about the greatest miracle being the miracle of salvation. And scriptures say that, and God demonstrated his love in this, right? Romans chapter 5, that while we were still sinners, what Christ died, So that means that there was no such a thing, okay, as the faith of man for the miracle of salvation to happen, right? Neither was there such a thing as the faith of Moses for the burning bush to occur. Neither was there such a thing as the faith of Lazarus, who was dead in the tomb, okay, for him to rise up. What does God say? Lazarus, come out, okay? And Lazarus is dead. I mean, he is dead. So God can work without your faith in terms of performing a miracle. And we are saying that God can perform a miracle in this last days. We're not saying that miracles have ceased in the sense of God cannot perform them, but He's not going to ask for your faith for Him to perform those. Yes, there are texts in Scripture where God Christ performs a miracle and the faith has healed you, right? Or your faith has made. We need to look at that in the context of the larger sense with which those miracles are happening. And John 20:31 helps us by saying that these things happen so that they may do what? Believe in that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. So you don't have faith, so you are not healed, means that God is going to work out His purposes with or without your faith. And He might choose that you are going to die out of that disease, or you're going to suffer the disease for a longer time, like 20 years or something like that. That's okay. He is still working out His good purposes because of that. And that has nothing to do with you not having faith. Actually, I know of someone, I think it's Roosevelt or something. She talks about her experience with, I think it's, she's paralyzed or something like that. And she says that she has asked God many times, and this is not about miracles anyway, it's about healing, many times to heal her, and God has not. Does that mean that she didn't have faith? No, she has faith. She trusts that God can heal her. But God chooses not to, for purposes that are beyond us. And God gives us a glimpse into those purposes in Romans 8, that we may be formed into the image of Christ in His likeness. Okay, so you telling me that I don't have enough faith, that is why the miracle is not happening? First of all, it's not like I'm expecting that God is going to perform a grand revelatory miracle in my life. But I believe that God is going to work in His goodness to heal me. But even if He doesn't do that, it doesn't mean I don't have faith. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Danson. I think that's indeed helpful. And so to wrap this up, whoever will be watching, you get to this point in this video, I'd like to challenge you by the definition of miracles. Do you think then that you see miracles today? And secondly, if you have never thought about God's goodness to Christians or to you as a believer, I'd like to urge you to think deeply about these things, because not only should we depend on miracles so that we can see a God who is loving, a God who's compassionate, a God who is kind, in the ordinary means, in the ordinary events that God uses, therein can we also see the goodness of God. We shouldn't be waiting for so-called breakthrough, so-called an extraordinary happenings so that we may see God's goodness toward us. So therefore, the burden is upon you to look unto these things and see that indeed the Lord, even shining the sun to you, is His good pleasure. The Lord granting you a child is His good pleasure. The Lord sustaining you in your illness is also God's good pleasure. So that's a subject that we'll talk on some other time on suffering. So guys, thank you so much for belaboring on the miracles on these things. So the Lord bless you.